Welcome to the Action Research Project about STEM perceptions. I'm Emily Nicholson, and I've completed this project with Brittany Vansel. We are students of the Purdue Curriculum and Instruction Master's Program with the emphasis on STEM education. Before I start, I want to thank you for showing interest in our project and give a huge shout out to the people who completed our survey and interviews to help us gather the data that we have to show you today. Just a quick overview of what we're going to talk about in this presentation, a quick introduction as to why we've chosen this project, what existing literature is already out there about STEM education, give you a little bit of information about the people that were included in the survey and interviews that we did, how we looked at our data and how we analyzed it, and then what this research really means. So how did people respond to both our survey and the interviews? What findings did we conclude from that? And then what is an action plan moving forward for people interested in STEM?
For our introduction, we wanted to make sure we covered our personal interest in this topic and defined our research question. As students of the Curriculum and Instruction Program with a concentration in integrated STEM, we were intrigued by our peers' perceptions of integrated STEM teaching. Some people seemed to love it, and some seemed to feel less positively. Our goal with this project was to identify and analyze integrated STEM perceptions from a large population of teachers to see if there were any recurring trends or patterns. Understanding that information will allow us to make recommendations for future STEM teaching. The research question we decided on was, what are teachers' perceptions of integrated STEM education? We were especially interested in teachers' definitions of STEM, their comfort levels teaching STEM, what they felt were pros and cons of integrated STEM, and what teaching tools and platforms they were aware of or used in their classrooms. The purpose of our project was really to understand these perceptions with the goal of working towards informing other teachers about the benefits of integrated STEM and methods to practice it. This topic is important to all teachers, specifically individual STEM teachers, and may help create more engaging and robust curriculums. We understand there's a need for a common definition of integrated STEM, which may help teachers understand its benefits and ways that it can be implemented in their classrooms.
We looked at the existing literature for STEM education and came up with two categories to focus our research. One was the definitions of STEM education, and then what are some of the pros and cons that surveys and literature show about STEM education. So first of all, looking at the types of integrated STEM, Bybee in his 2013 research refers to 9 different types of integrated STEM. And one of the challenges with this is that because there's so many different types of integrated STEM, it's hard for schools, districts, and teachers to decide what STEM means in their context. So we've run through all 9 types in the following slides. If you want to take a closer look at them, you can open up the presentation. I'll just go through a few. The first big one is that STEM is science or math focused, and then everything kind of trickles under it. So the remaining discipline areas. Again, STEM and math being the big disciplines here, incorporating some of the others, having 4 separate courses, connecting those courses to each other, coordination between all of them, combining some of these disciplines together, having multiple disciplines overlapping with each other, and finally having one course that refers to all of the disciplines. Now, as expected, there's always going to be some pros and cons towards STEM education. A lot of the pros that we found in different areas of research were preparing students for the workforce, building on those STEM and social identities and 21st century competencies that get students ready for the workforce. Also, increased student engagement was a big theme that came out through literature, and students just enjoying what they're doing in class more. and having some STEM literacy. So again, coming back to those 21st century competencies and understanding how the subjects might integrate with each other. Now the cons, one of them we just shared, 9 of them, is that there's no clear definition as to what integrated STEM means, which presents a challenge for educators as to how to approach STEM. Another challenge can be application across the subject disciplines and making those clear connections for students. Teacher confidence is a con, as some teachers don't feel that they have the background knowledge to teach students about the different disciplines or how to integrate them with each other. And finally, the difficulty of goal setting. With the open-endedness that STEM can sometimes bring with it, students are unsure what the end goal is and where they need to go from there. As mentioned previously, we created a survey and sent it out to a large number of educators to get their feedback on STEM perceptions. We got a lot of responses from people all around the US and even some responses from teachers abroad. We shared our survey through our personal Facebook pages and also some educator groups on Facebook and others. Brittany and I are both 6th grade teachers, and so as you'll see, the majority of our respondents came from that upper elementary and middle school teacher level, as that's where the most of our professional connections come from. We ended up with a total of 144 people responding to our survey. We collected some background information on what grade level and subjects people taught, but did not focus on any personally identifying information like names, location, or race. After we collected that initial data, then we picked people to further interview to gather some more detailed information about their responses. As you can see here, this is where the majority of our upper elementary and middle school responses came from, but we also got a fair amount of lower elementary and some middle school and very few in higher education or administration. As mentioned, we also looked at what subject areas our respondents taught. A lot of them came from an elementary setting, 40% there, of teaching all subjects or the core subjects in their classrooms. And then our higher respondents also came from the sciences and math. We did get a few reading and writing in that English department and social studies, and then some specialist teachers in there and extra learning support. So looking at our methods, how did we do our survey and what did those interviews include? Going through an initial plan, we started in August 22nd of 2021, looking at what we were interested in talking about. How did we want this action research project to proceed? We then wrote and sent out the survey to the largest population of educators that we knew. After that, we realized that having some interviews with a few of those educators would deepen our results. We also analyzed that data both from the survey and from the interviews to better understand, get a full picture view of what integrated STEM looked like. And then at the end of this presentation, you'll see our action plan based on those results. So why we did the survey and the interviews we did, we wanted to conduct a short survey just to get as many opinions from as many teachers as we could, get as diverse of a group of teachers that we could, and Google Forms allowed us to collect that data easily, store it, and it even made some of our graphs for us. We then jumped into the interviews to better understand different points of views, looking at various perspectives. So when we were choosing the people to interview, we looked at those who supported integrated STEM, those who were unsure about it, and those who did not like the idea of integrated STEM. And so that helped us then dig deeper into the survey questions and understand their perspectives. As I said, the survey design was to get out to as many teachers as we could and get their opinions. This is an overview of the survey that we sent out. We tried to make it as short and quick as possible so teachers didn't have to spend a lot of time in their already busy schedules to fill it out. After we got our survey in, we chose 5 more individuals to interview. And we used these interview questions to gather some deeper information.
So for our data analysis, we really wanted to cover how we coded our data, the correlations we were able to make, and everything else that we did to really get as much information from these survey and interview responses as possible. So since we had people type responses to a survey and we ended up with tons of responses, it really felt overwhelming to code all of these responses to every single question by hand. So instead, we took a different approach and we transformed this textual data into categorical data, and we used an open source AI called scikit-learn to code and categorize all of these responses. And here is a little bit of an explanation of how that process works, because it's something that I found super interesting to do. So we did something called natural language processing, which is the process of using rule-based programming to extract statistical representations from textual data. So first, we used a survey to collect data, and then we processed those text responses through an open source application called scikit-learn. Scikit-learn actually applies a method called TF-IDF, represented on this visual here, called term frequency inverse document frequency. TF-IDF creates a numerical representation of the individual responses, which can then be grouped together into similar response classes. So essentially, it's a numerical statistic intended to reflect how important a word is to an entire data set, or this calls it a document. So TF-IDF works by combining all of the responses to a survey question into one big massive document. Then it finds the frequency of a given word in the total document and compares it to the frequency that that word appears in the individual responses. That creates a numerical representation of how rare or how common a keyword is in the data set as a whole. By comparing the responses keywords together between each other, groups of similar responses can be created. This essentially coded our data for us because it sorted it into groups of responses that contained similar keywords, and it generated a list of which responses were in each group. So from there, we could read through these groups and generate categorical names for each group. So here's an example of that. Our question, what benefits do you see from implementing integrated STEM in the classroom? The keywords that the program came up with for us are in the top row here, and it counted how many individual responses used those keywords. From there, we were able to read through those individual responses and get a general sense of what they were actually trying to say and come up with a renamed category that better encompassed all of those responses. Something extra neat that we were able to do was actually relational analysis. So we were able to compare demographic data that our survey responses contained to individual answers that people gave. So we were able to make a lot of these relational charts that showed the relationship between demographic groups and various responses. So all of the horizontal bars represent a demographic group. So this chart here shows the number of lessons taught versus known tools and platforms that people indicated on their survey. So each bar represents one of these groups scaled to 100%. The percent of people in each group who answered each question in a specific way is indicated with a color code. So on this graph, for example, the darkest blue shows what percent of people in each group answered that they used Google as a STEM tool or a platform. When we were analyzing our interview responses, we compared them to survey results and to the other interviews to find common threads amongst them. This information helped reinforce data gathered from the survey and provided a lot more detail. All of the people that we interviewed were either 5th or 6th grade teachers. We were able to find one person to interview who was opposed to integrated STEM. 2 of our interviewees were neutral towards integrated STEM, and 2 of our other interviewees were advocates for integrated STEM. So here's the findings that we were able to discover through our research from our survey, from our interview results, and with all of that extra relational analysis. So like I said before, we use the TF-IDF method. We were able to code all of our textual responses into major categories. And now we have graphs for all of our questions that indicated the number of responses in each category. Here are the graphs that show the frequency of coded responses to all of our questions. When asked what STEM means to you, the highest response we had was things indicating real world applications to academics, creative problem solving, etc. This surprised me because that was more frequent than just people writing science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. When asked what integrated STEM instruction looks like to you, the most frequent response was that STEM should be integrated into the whole curriculum across all subjects. When asked how many integrated STEM lessons people had taught, answers were really across the board, with 16 to 30 lessons being our least popular response. When asked if people enjoyed teaching integrated STEM on a scale from 1 to 5, most of our responses were between 3 and 5. When asked how they felt about implementing integrated STEM in their classroom on a scale of 1 to 5, answers were a little more spread, with most still between 3 and 5, but with a lot more 1s and 2s on this question. When asked about potential obstacles from integrated STEM, we had responses across the board. These are responses from our given checkboxes, with things like not having the right materials or enough time as the most prominent answers. In the box for other responses, we got a ton of different things. They were really infrequent, but we had all sorts of things like not seeing students all enough, students not liking it, or not being able to integrate it in with their academic standards. Benefits from implementing integrated STEM, the most prominently mentioned was understanding relationships between subjects, primarily science and math. Known tools and platforms that people mentioned were also really across the board, with Google being the most mentioned, but with tons of other options being spread out with various levels of frequency. On our question where we asked for additional thoughts, we had a few really interesting responses. Some teachers felt like anything could be a STEM lesson. Some felt that STEM is really just a buzzword, but we don't know exactly what it means or what to do with it. Some teachers felt it was hard to communicate with other grade levels. And a good point was made that high stakes testing don't really acknowledge or assess integrated STEM, which could make it challenging to implement it in your classroom. Other teachers thought that it could stay as an after-school program, but that it wasn't really necessary in the classroom. And one teacher made a good point that perhaps we should start doing things like this in kindergarten so that it's easier to work with students on these skills when they're older. So now we're actually able to dive into the relational findings that we were able to find from this data set. So using these survey responses, we were able to analyze the relationship between things like demographic or categorical questions and other responses. We were able to notice some really interesting relationships between different groups of people that answers questions in a specific way. So the first thing that we're going to look at is the grade level that people taught versus the number of STEM lessons that they taught. We can see that teachers in lower grades were more likely to indicate that they had not taught 31 plus lessons, and that as students get older, more teachers indicated that they had taught more lessons. When looking at teachers' definitions of STEM, it was pretty agreed upon across the board that STEM stood for science, technology, engineering, and math, but other than that, we had answers all across the board. Some of our common themes in responses were hands-on approaches to science and math, real-world applications, and connections between academics. These charts show different groups and their perceptions of STEM definitions. When we look at grade level versus definition of integrated STEM, we can see that real-world application and science, technology, engineering, math were our most frequently answered responses, with less people indicating things like hands-on approach. When we look at grade level taught versus what STEM instruction looks like, we can see that our most common response is still STEM integrated into the whole curriculum, and that as students get older, again, grade 6 to grade 8, the least amount of people indicated that STEM included hands-on problem solving, which was interesting. When we look at teachers' comfort levels teaching STEM, it really was no surprise that the more lessons that somebody had taught, the more comfortable they felt teaching integrated STEM. So we really feel like if teachers are willing to take the risk and move outside of their comfort zones to give it a try, teaching integrated STEM could become a lot easier over time. That ended up being a pretty linear relationship, with the more number of lessons that somebody had taught, the more comfortable they felt teaching integrated STEM. We had lots of different pros mentioned for teaching integrated STEM, and overwhelmingly, our respondents agreed that integrated STEM helped students make connections between disciplines, primarily science and math. When we look at some of these graphs, we can see that no matter what grade level somebody taught, the most frequently answered response was students understood the relationship between subjects. Interestingly, after grade 6, we didn't have any teachers indicate that the benefits included increased student engagement. And as students get older, more teachers were likely to mention something about students recognizing real-world connections. When we look at subject area taught, again, our most frequent responses remain the same, and everything else is pretty across the board, which we would expect since we had a wide range of subject areas mentioned. When we look at the number of STEM lessons mentioned or taught versus benefits, again, relationships continued to be the largest, and real-world connections continued to grow the more lessons that somebody had taught. When we look at cons of teaching integrated STEM, we had things like time and materials mentioned as extensive limiters to teaching these lessons, as well as lack of priority from school districts, teachers not feeling knowledgeable enough. COVID pandemic was a big factor, and several teachers also mentioned concern about following restrictive guidelines. When we analyzed our cons or obstacles in these charts, we were unable to mention the responses from our other category on our question, mostly because each of them was only indicated one time. When we look at grade level taught versus obstacles, everything was pretty evenly distributed across the board. Again, the same with subject area, everything was pretty evenly spread. When we look at the number of STEM lessons taught versus obstacles, it is interesting to see that the more lessons that somebody has taught, the less they were likely to indicate that they did not feel knowledgeable enough to teach it. When you think about it, that makes sense, because the more somebody has done, the more knowledgeable they likely feel about the topic. When we look at teaching tools and platforms that were mentioned from our survey, we noticed that there was not a clearly defined list of resources, and we really feel like having a well-known data bank could be beneficial for everybody. When we look at grade level taught versus tools and platforms, we're able to see that some things really stand out, like Google shows up in every grade. Teachers Pay Teachers shows up quite a bit. Teachers in younger grades, like kindergarten through grade 5, mentioned Mystery Science, which is an elementary school science curriculum. And teachers in grade 6 through grade 12 mentioned Kessler Science, which is a 6 to 9 approximately science curriculum. Everything else was pretty much across the board, with a lot of things getting a few mentions in each grade area. When we look at the number of STEM lessons somebody's taught versus these tools and platforms, we can still see that Google is very prominent. Again, same with Teachers Pay Teachers. Things like Mystery Science, Kessler Science, STEM Scopes, Project Lead the Way, they all were more evenly distributed throughout, which again agrees with our assessment that there is not a well-known data bank or list of resources that people commonly pull from. Some limitations for our study were that 82% of our respondents taught between grades 3 and grades 8. So we're missing a lot of responses below grade 3 and above grade 8. 40% of our respondents taught all disciplines in an elementary setting, and 49% of our respondents taught science or math or a combination of the two. Because we had most of our responses come from these categories, this left out perceptions of lower education, higher education, and other subjects like English, social studies, specialist teachers, and other things. Another thing that we didn't think about was collecting geographic or location data for our respondents. But without that, we weren't able to analyze if somebody's location influenced how they were able to teach in their classroom, or if we had a misrepresentation by having all of our teachers from Indiana or from Texas or from one place rather than an even spread. If we were to do this survey again, we would probably ask for some sort of location indicator so we were able to make that kind of analysis.
Now we're going to analyze some of the information gathered from the interview. As discussed earlier, we picked 3 different categories. So those who were advocates for integrated STEM, those who were in the middle, and those who were against it. One of our respondents, as an advocate for STEM education, responded that it was a great way to teach cross-curricular hands-on activities that solve real-world problems and aid society. And this is a theme that came out through the literature as well. In Bybee, they talk about arguments for STEM integration stress that learning is enhanced when individual disciplines are placed in an integrated context because that content has more meaningful context. So looking at how everything gets integrated together, and in the workforce readiness, students don't see just one subject at a time. They have to take into consideration all of it when solving these problems. Those who are neutral towards integrated STEM, one of our respondents says that it gives students a break from the normal classroom routine. This matches up with the literature that talks about how students can be highly engaged in STEM, integrated STEM activities, how they really enjoy the work that they do, and maybe they don't learn the content as exactly intended. Now, those who aren't advocates for STEM integration talked about how that connection and building of that knowledge can be very difficult to make. So it can be a very fun activity, but students don't necessarily see the learning and the connections between the subjects, which is exactly what we saw in some of the literature as well, is that students don't necessarily recognize the ways in which math and science can support their engineering work. So making those cross-curricular connections. Our interview respondents also had a lot of similarities to the survey. They talked about some of the constraints of integrated STEM education being the time and materials. They also discussed how integrated STEM is sometimes seen as an after-school program or an extra activity, something to do on a fun Friday, and that it's not necessarily a full-blown course that students would be taking. They did see the importance of the team building and critical thinking practice that students engage in when doing integrated STEM. There was definitely some uncertainty about where to start, like the idea of how fun it is, the good team building, the critical thinking, but how do we actually start with that? And a big question asking themselves about the materials. And interestingly enough, in the survey results, we saw a lot of people talking about roller coasters as a STEM activity that their students have enjoyed. And that came out in 3 of our 5 interview respondents as well. Now that we've discussed all the work that we put in, the big question is, well, what do we do with that information? So what is our conclusion and the action plan moving forward? First off, we looked at what does this mean for teachers? A lot of teachers were unsure about how to start with integrated STEM, and we've got some ideas for you here at the end of the presentation. But also realize the rewards that can come with some integrated STEM. As pointed out in some of our graphs, you notice that the more teachers practice integrated STEM, the more comfortable they become with it. So take that risk, be willing to try something new. And over time, you're going to learn and you're going to make it a better experience for yourself and for your students. Also, a theme that came out was the uncertainty and that background knowledge that teachers don't feel comfortable with. So how can we as teachers look at some PD or extra courses that we can take to increase background knowledge across all of these disciplines to make that implementation of integrated STEM feel successful? Talking about the implications for administrators, it's important with time and resources being that limiting factor that came up as a lot of responses, that the administration really needs to look at how they want to allocate classes, time, and resources. So if you want integrated STEM in your school, are you giving teachers enough time and resources to go through the process fully? That also then needs to be communicated to the staff of the school. If this is going to be something that you want to focus on, make sure that staff are ready for that and give them maybe the necessary training and professional development to do so. Curriculum developers, definitely looking at what is integrated STEM. How can we come up with a common, clear definition of what integrated STEM is and what it looks like? Finding resources for integrated STEM was a challenge for a lot of teachers. So if there's any sort of common database as curriculum developers are looking at how they can create these lessons, where can we store them so it's easy for teachers to find? Also, when creating lessons, looking at that time and materials. So is there a way that we can make integrated STEM lessons that are short, quick, and don't take a lot of materials that someone might not have available in their classroom or through asking for donations? And finally, the implications for researchers, for people who want to continue building on the research that we've done here. We saw a lot of common trends towards integrated STEM from a variety of educators. Our survey respondents and interviews came from a lot of different people, and there were some very common themes that came out through that. Maybe considering looking at what can be done to dig into these correlations further, looking at what people are teaching, how they feel towards STEM, what grade levels are focusing on STEM, and focusing on those correlations to figure out where to move forward.
Findings from our study showed that teachers really struggle with both finding STEM-related resources and with figuring out how to use them in the classroom. We decided to create a list of resources that are STEM-related that we thought might be useful for teachers looking for lesson inspiration. Some of these resources were mentioned by teachers in our survey, and some of them were resources that we found from doing our own research on this topic. All of these are resources that teachers can use in their classroom to help them teach integrated STEM. We do have a few suggestions for the future. Our survey data implied that many teachers don't really know where to begin when it comes to teaching integrated STEM. A suggestion that we have for schools is to offer a professional development session, maybe organized by administration or school's curriculum partner or curriculum director. And an idea that we had for this would be for a teacher leader to model how to teach and implement a meaningful integrated STEM lesson. Maybe by having an example lesson, other teachers could feel more comfortable mimicking this style of teaching in their classroom. Our next steps for action research, if we were to continue, would be to interview school administrators to discuss their building-wide integrated STEM implementation plans. We'd also like to interview curriculum developers to discuss what resources they have for teachers hoping to implement integrated STEM. And we might suggest to them the creation of an easy-to-navigate database of their STEM lessons and resources. We'd also like to interview students to gauge their interest in STEM and knowledge that they've learned from integrated STEM lessons that they've been taught in the classroom. Some research questions that we have for the future are, is there a difference in integrated STEM instructions at public schools versus private schools? How would it be possible for us to provide resources, like we mentioned earlier, and scaffolding to teachers that indicated that they were not comfortable teaching integrated STEM? And then how could we remeasure their comfort level with teaching integrated STEM after they've been given these resources? Would we see any growth? What would be the most effective form of professional development for teachers on integrated STEM? And is there a discrepancy between how teachers and administrators define integrated STEM? Here are the references that we use to inform our research. If you are interested, make sure that you check these out. Thank you for watching our presentation.